All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I hope 2020 is treating you all well so far. My name is Katie Monahan, and I'm a communications strategist here at the Ohio Arts Council, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Categorize to Connect, Strategies for Audience Engagement. So one of the key components of effective marketing is know your audience, and today's presenter is here to show us how to do just that. But before we get rolling with our presentation, I have just a few things to go over. First, if you enjoy these webinars and you're looking for more OAC-hosted PD opportunities this year, be sure to join us in Akron May 6th through 8th for Arts Impact Ohio 2020. Arts Impact Ohio is the OAC's biennial statewide professional development conference, providing relevant, action-oriented, forward-looking content for members of the state's arts and cultural sector. We had more than 300 people attend when we were in Columbus in 2018, and we're really excited to build on that as we travel the conference to Akron this spring. And we're in the process of finalizing the agenda, which features a fantastic lineup of presenters, arts experiences, and performances that you won't want to miss. So follow that link you see there on your screen and be sure to register today. We hope to see you there. Now onto a few housekeeping items. Everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. This just helps to cut down on any feedback issues during the presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A box in your control panel, and we'll do our best to incorporate the questions as they roll in through the webinar, and we'll, of course, leave plenty of time at the end for questions as well. If you have any audio issues or trouble connecting, we recommend refreshing your browser, and if that doesn't work, try logging off and then logging back in. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll post the recording on our YouTube channel by the end of business on Friday, January 31st, so tomorrow. So if you aren't able to catch the entire live session or you'd like to listen again, you can find it there. So that's it for housekeeping. Now on to the main presentation. And with us today is Ara G. Beal, CEO of the Storybook Foundry, and as of about 2 to 3 weeks ago, the new executive director of Tailspinner Children's Theater in Cleveland. So somewhere between relocating and learning the ropes in her new position, Ara has found the time to plan this webinar, and so we're really grateful to have her here with us. Ara, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Yes, it's been a bit of a whirlwind this January, but that's okay. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to talk with the OAC community about being more impactful in your communications and marketing. So to get us started, I believe in participation from people who I'm working with. So there's going to be a couple of times today where I'm going to give you some time to do some brainstorming to be prepared for that. If you have a notebook or some scrap paper and a pen nearby, that will certainly help you. If it's easy for you to access a marketing plan or calendar, or maybe if you have a stack of some recent mailings that have gone out nearby, I will give you a couple of seconds while I introduce myself a little bit more before we get into the meat of things. If you want to grab those and just have those nearby, that's going to help you out. And of course, as Katie said, this is recorded. So if you need to go back and get those things later and just fast forward and rewind to various parts of what we talked about today, you of course will have that opportunity as well. So this is me. As Katie was kind enough to mention, I did just start as the executive director of Tailspinner's Children's Theater up here in Cleveland. And I just relocated to Cleveland from the Dayton area. So I'm figuring out lots of things up here. I work professionally as a designer and a director, and that has really influenced the work that I do when I consult with nonprofits around communications. Because part of what you have to do as a director or a producer is get everybody who's on your team telling the same story. And as I was working on things, it occurred to me how much I had learned in trying to streamline those communications could really work well when it comes to marketing and communicating what a nonprofit is trying to do. So there's a long blurb on the right-hand side of your screen, but the important part is, you know, I really try to help small and mighty nonprofits increase their capacity for clear communications, being realistic with their limits on time, know-how, and of course, dollars. So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about 4 kind of general concepts. We're going to talk about these pretty big picture. not so much in detail because there's a lot to cover. And I'm going to use some examples and specifics as we move through that might apply to your organization, but might not. So we can talk some later about how you can maybe tweak some of the ideas that we cover today to your more specific organization. We're going to start, we are going to define our terms. We're going to talk about audience and also branding and some different types of branding. And then we're going to talk about different types of audiences. So how you might start to classify different audiences that you're interacting with and communicating with. We'll then examine how branding and audience intersect, right? So how can, now that I've classified my audiences, how do I want to adjust my branding and communications? We're going to talk a little bit about an audience funnel. And then we're going to finish with an application exercise, and I'm going to end with some kind of hands-on organizational tips. So whether you're looking for kind of some idea brainstorming time or whether you're looking for some really practical ideas, you should find both of those here today and hopefully leave with something that is useful to you and your organization. Just a reminder, if you haven't already or you're joining us late, to go ahead and make sure you have something to take some notes on, do some brainstorming on. And if you have any information on hand about some of the communications you're already doing, that's going to be helpful to you. Okay, so now we can get started. So what is an audience and why do you care about dividing them out? Why a lot of smaller organizations that don't have the time or know-how might use a scattershot approach, which is, we have this great picture, I really like it, I'm going to send it to everyone. Or we have this testimonial, it's beautiful, it's going out to everyone on everything. And what we're going to talk about today is really thinking strategically about who your audiences are, what you want them to do, and the best way to communicate that to them. So before we go any further, I do want to define our term audience. And that way, all of us sitting around our various computers and devices can be on the same page. So I've pulled this from Merriam-Webster. And Merriam-Webster actually has a couple of different definitions. But there's two that I really like and are of use to us today. Both are nouns, of course. And the first is a group of listeners or spectators. And this is something that separates arts nonprofits from other nonprofits. Health and human services nonprofits don't tend to have a lot of spectators coming in and seeing products that they are working on. In the arts, we tend to have gallery shows, concerts, theater productions, people are viewing videos, whatever it might be. But we have that spectators and listeners. Another audience, and this one is true of almost all nonprofits, is that group of ardent admirers and devotees. And I like to use the example, I work in the children's theater realm. There's this amazing organization in England called Oily Cart that really focuses on theater for the very young, so birth to 2. Am I ever going to actually make it to England to actually spectate and see one of their shows? Well, I hope so. But in the meantime, I fall into the second category and I follow them on social media. They have some books. I've read that kind of thing. So I'm in that more admirer devotee realm. So we're going to kind of combine those together. And for our purposes today, we're going to think of an audience as a specific type of person or group of people that you wish to reach and spur into action. So let's talk about how some of those different classifications of audiences might be. Okay, so here we have this graphical representation of all these different types of groups of people that are all part of our audience base. We have some families, we have some couples, individuals. There's an owl because it was cute and I wanted to include it. So we have all these different groups that we're trying to reach out. And it's hard if we have them all kind of muddled together to be strategic and smart in how we're reaching them. So what we're going to kind of do throughout this entire webinar is divide them into groups. And so here I've taken them and I've put them into columns and sort of identified which group they're in. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But what I want to point out here is that you have people, individuals, even groups that are in more than one category. Your classification of audiences is not a strict thing. People are going to move throughout different audiences during their relationship with you. People might be in more than one audience, and that's okay. Don't get so fixated on, I have to figure out exactly which audience this person is in, that you lose sight of kind of that bigger picture, that it is kind of a fluid thing. So we have our couple in the pink, and they show up in 2 categories. We have this group in the green, and they're in all 3. So keep in mind that this is a fluid existence that we're talking about today. So as we sort of identify and classify our audiences, as I indicated, most arts nonprofits have at least 3. So you have your artist, you have your doers. So whether they're creating visual art that you're displaying or they're participating in a performance, whether they're kids or seniors, you have some sort of people who are doing art that you are supporting. Then you have your spectators/consumers. So these are people who are coming to your performances, your concerts, your gallery openings, people who maybe are buying art from your visual artist. And then the last category is supporters. And the most obvious one here is, of course, your donors, people who are giving you money. But also in this category are legislators, grantors, volunteers, board members, people who are giving their time, talent, or treasure to kind of help you keep doing what you're doing. If you work with youth or another group, you might have families of those that are served, that are sort of either a subset of an audience or maybe even your own separate audience. And how you navigate that really depends on how your organization is set up. Are you primarily working only with children, or are you working with different groups and youth as just part of who you serve? But that's sort of a common subset to keep in your mind as we work through this today. So we go back to this, these icons. These are going to pop up a couple of times today. And so now you can see that we have, not only do we have our 3 groups, but I've sort of identified each group with a representative icon at the top. So all the way on the left, you have your artist, they're musicians in this example. In the middle, you have your spectators, which I guess since we're doing music, maybe I should have put an ear instead of an eye, but hopefully you get the gist. And then at the end on the right, you have your supporters. So I've divided them up. I've sort of categorized or classified them all, and I've indicated where they go. So now I can start trying to reach those specific targeted audiences and vary my techniques between the 3. So I just want to do a quick check-in and make sure that everybody is kind of with me, see if there are any questions at this point before we roll into starting to talk about branding.
Yeah, and just a reminder for those who came in late, if you do have any questions, go ahead and type them into your Q&A box there in your control panel. And it looks like we're good right now, Ara, so we'll keep rolling.
Great. Hopefully everybody is paying attention and not everybody has wandered off to bet on the Super Bowl or anything. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's move on. Now that we've kind of covered some of the basics about audiences, we're going to talk about branding. And branding is, of course, important for many reasons, and we could do many webinars just on branding alone, but I'll hit some of the high points. So branding breaks down into 2 types for me. I find it really useful to think about branding in 2 ways. There's visual branding, and there's linguistic branding. And we're going to talk about both of those. So in the whole pot of branding, you probably already have pieces of these. How firm they are, how well recorded they are will vary from group to group, but most likely you have a logo. You have some colors and fonts that you use. If you are a 501c3, you have to have a mission statement. Of course, if you know where it is and what it is maybe another question. Pictures have really become extra important as we move into the digital realm. It's so easy to take them and share them. You know, you're probably building up a really nice base of those. Elevator speech, website copy, social media, and then of course print we can't forget about, even though there is so much electronic that's going to happen. So these are things that you probably already have. Probably if you were in your office, you can look around and you can see most of these things without walking away from your desk. So that's that's the big categories. One of the smaller categories within that is the idea of linguistic branding. And I really like this trend when you're working on a branding guide to establish your tone with an is and is not list. So this is from MailChimp, which is an email client. And for example, they're smart but not stodgy. They're expert but not bossy. And it really aligns how they want to come across to their audiences in a really straightforward way, because tone can be quite hard to describe. Also, what words are you using as part of your linguistic branding? What do you call yourself? What is your name? I work in theater. Are you an RE or an ER theater is an important part of branding. Part of your branding and communications is reading level. And we're going to talk more about reading level as we start talking about our specific audiences. And also, how much time do you expect audiences to spend with your material? Are you really communicating a lot in long form? Are you doing a lot more stuff that's like tweet sized or caption sized? You know, what type of linguistic communications are you sending out? And then of course, there's the one you probably think of more commonly with branding, which is visual branding. And a really good test for if you have a strong visual brand is to take someone who knows something about your organization, find a bulletin board in a public place that's really full, stick one of your pieces up there and ask them to walk by and see if they can pick yours out without stopping to look for it. If they can identify it just by the visual brand, you know you're in good shape. If they have to hunt and peck for it, you might want to do some work on your visual branding. But you do want everything to tie together. However, when you're communicating with these different audiences, you are going to vary within the rules that you've established a little bit. Why branding matters. Again, this could be a whole separate webinar, but not only is, if you're consistent in your branding, is your stuff going to look more professional and it's going to be easy to recognize your materials, it also makes your life a lot easier. If you have a set format for all of your posters, you just have to pull things out and put them back in. It's a whole lot easier to type the code for your color into your email than to play around with that big wheel of colors and try to find the one that fits. So it's really going to make your life a lot easier if you can establish some of these branding guidelines. Okay, check in. Are we still good, Katie?
We are still good.
Yay, okay. So,
you're doing great.
Everyone's doing great. This is collaborative.
We're all just absorbing all the great information.
Yes. So let's talk about how the two intersect, which is of course what you actually came here to hear about today. So again, we'll go back to this. Here's all of these different pieces of branding that you probably already have. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the way that you might vary within these specific types of branding between your three audiences. And I am going to use these three audiences, the artist, the spectator, and the supporter, for an example as we move through. Just again, a reminder, those might not be exactly what fits for your organization, but hopefully you'll be able to apply the ideas and extrapolate the information so that you're still able to apply it to your organization. Okay, so I have my three different audiences here, classifications: my artist, my spectators or consumers, and my supporters. In the caps underneath each audience, what I've done is just make myself a quick note about what type of information I'm going to want to share with these. So with my artist, I'm going to share the style and type of work that we're doing so they can tell if they're a good fit for us and we're a good fit for them. With spectators, I'm really probably communicating about things they can attend. And then for my supporters, my main goal is to share the impact my organization is having. Then what I've done is I've taken all of our different varieties of branding that we might already have, and I've tweaked them between the categories. There's a lot here. I'm not going to go through each and every one. I'm going to kind of hit some highlights. So you have, your logo and your fonts and your colors, and probably that's going to feature very prominently when you're talking to your artists and spectators. However, for your supporters, maybe not. We don't tend to write grant applications, for example, in our brand font. We tend to use whatever font the system allows. We don't necessarily do a lot of logo color and font choice when we're writing our annual appeal letters. So those maybe we're not necessarily seeing as much logo and color use when we're communicating with our supporters as with our other two groups. Elevator speech is one that varies greatly between the three. And honestly, I always encourage organizations, everybody at your organization should have a slightly different elevator speech because there should be something personal in it for them. So if you're doing an elevator speech where you're going to talk to artists about participating with your organization, you might want to talk about how you help artists grow, what professional development you offer, things that are going to support them as a growing artist. With supporters, you're definitely going to talk about your impact. So how many artists did you help in the past year? Or how many kids attended your classes? And then with your spectators, it's probably going to be more about what a great time everybody has and what the great opportunities art you have to see. The pictures one is also one, if you move down, it's the fourth one down by my little picture icon, where you're going to kind of have very different pictures that are going to be highlighted depending on who you're communicating with. So for your artists, you probably are going to have pictures of work that's been done in the past. You might maybe have a picture of an artist that has worked with you winning an award, right? For spectators, you're going to have very event-oriented pictures. So maybe pictures of people looking at art, but also pictures of the art itself to kind of pull people in. Versus for your supporters, if you're working on, whether you're sending them to a grant application or to donors, you're going to want to use a picture of an impact that you're having. So if you offer educational opportunities, you might very well use a picture of kids learning how to draw, because that demonstrates for that group the impact that you're having. At the very bottom here, one of the things I've sort of kind of tagged onto this, and we could go into it again more in depth, but I don't want to lose too much time on it, is the idea of CTAs, or call to action. So what do you want this audience to do upon hearing from you? So for your artist, you want them to engage in the art that you're offering. For your spectators, you want them to attend, and your supporters, you want them to give, whether it's a grant, money, time, talent, treasure, all of that. So these are just some different ways you can think about how you're going to vary slightly the communications that you're sending out based on which audience class you're trying to reach. And then briefly, I do also want to talk about how linguistics can vary between your different audiences. One of the important things to think about is that reading level, particularly when we're talking about accessibility. So the general rule of thumb at this point, unless they've lowered it recently, which maybe they have, is that when you're writing for the general public, you need to be at about a 5th grade reading level, right? That's what our newspapers are written at. And when you're writing for supporters, you probably are writing at a higher reading level. You're communicating at a higher reading level because those people tend to be more engaged with the type of information that you're sharing. And probably the same for artists, though not always necessarily. Particularly if you look down at the bottom column, when you're talking with artists, you're going to be able to use, I use the word jargon, though that word isn't always my favorite, but you're going to be able to use a lot more high technical terms. You can be really specific about the type of art, the history, the actual techniques behind it when you're communicating with audiences than you're going to do when you're communicating with consumers. You're more interested in attention grabbing and helping them figure out where to categorize the type of art that you do. So you might make a comparison to another well-known artist or another well-known style or piece of art. So for both artists and spectators, and this isn't on this slide, but I encourage you to write it down because sometimes I turn into a little bit of a high school English teacher. But for both of those, you really are going to probably use a lot of adjectives and some nouns because you're going to do a lot of description. With supporters, you want to use a lot of verbs because again, we're getting back to that idea of impact. And impact is a verb. You are having action. You are causing something to happen. So one of the things that you can do if you're ever, bored in a meeting or while you're listening to a webinar, for example, is take something that you've written and go through and just circle those verbs, circle those action words. How many of them are you using? then go back and kind of count your adjectives. How many of those are you using? And then think about how you might want to vary what your kind of word count is based on who you are communicating with. So as an example, I actually pulled the Ohio Arts Council webpage. Thank you, OAC, because they do an excellent job on the homepage of their website identifying who they think their 4 main audiences are. So when I went to this, I was like, aha, they know exactly who they're trying to communicate, and that those 4 groups need slightly different information. So we're going to take a look. They have the red arrow shows you where on the website. It's right on the center of their homepage. And then you can click through and look at information for different audiences. So for artists, the information that they have here is primarily opportunities for entry, awards, the 1% for art and the poet laureate, directors databases. So information that artists are going to need. For, let's see, organizations, this is very grant heavy because that's the main way the OAC interacts with organizations, of course, is through providing grant support. So it tells you about all the different grant programs. You can click on it. On the left, they really highlight those grants and the grants and guidelines. So they're really communicating that information. And then for the public, one of the things that I love about this public page is it's the only of the 3 pages that really kind of highlights social media. So right at the center on the bottom, kind of right above the picture, they have the link to all their social media. But this is a very event opportunity heavy page, right? It takes you to the newsfeed and the blog, the newsletter, the gallery, the awards for the arts. So all of this is about opportunities to go see art. So within these 3 audiences, they don't necessarily have a really different visual brand that's happening, but they are sharing very different information and connecting people with very different resources. So it's a nice opportunity, a nice example of how you can pull out, even on your own website, information for different audiences to find. If you are not a chart person and you're a Venn diagram person, and I'm kind of a Venn diagram person, which is probably why this ended up in here. Another way you can sort of display this information and create for yourself and think it through is to do a Venn diagram. So I have my 3 circles for artist, audience or spectator, and supporters. And I just filled in some quick ideas about things that might overlap between those categories. And things that I would want to share to maybe more than one audience, and things that are probably going to be more specific to an individual audience. So the information that you're communicating is half of it. The other half then is how you're adjusting your branding, both visual and linguistic, so that you're reaching your audience the best way. Okay, how are we doing? We still good?
We're doing great. No questions, but I'm really glad to hear that we here at the OAC are doing things right. So thanks for the shout out on the website.
Yeah, exactly. You can use that as a testimonial, which we're going to talk about later. So
fantastic.
Okay, so excuse me, I need a little bit of water there. I'm doing a lot of talking. So let's go ahead and I'm going to have you guys do some brainstorming. So go ahead and grab a piece of paper. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, and I want you to first work on brainstorming specific audiences. So I have some examples here if you want to, but specific groups that you've reached out. So attendees at a recent gala, a particular grade that you tried to reach, attendees to a specific event, whatever it might be. Who are some specific organizations that are specific groups that you have tried to hit in recent communications? So I'm going to give you about, again, that 30 seconds. About 5 more seconds. Okay, and you probably didn't get them all, and that's okay. Just a reminder for brainstorming, we're not doing any editing, we're not overthinking, we're just kind of seeing what jumps out of our brain onto the page. You can always go back, of course, and do this with a little more time. You can do something like this with your staff or with your board and see what other ideas they might come up. So we kind of have come up with kind of these specific audiences. Now I want to work on classifying them. So I want you to take your list of what you've just written. You can either rewrite it, you can draw some icons and pictures or put letters next to, or however you want to kind of start grouping people together and classifying how they work out. So I'm going to give you about another 25 seconds to start on that. Take about 5 more seconds to finish up. So here's an example of what I did. I actually copied mine into a new piece of paper and wrote them as a list. Also, important part of brainstorming is that when you're doing it yourself, it doesn't really matter if other people can read it. So you can see that I was writing rather quickly on this one. But then I kind of made a little icon for myself to divide them up, because that's kind of how my brain works. So much like the icons that were in the list that we looked at earlier, I kind of divided mine into spectators / consumers. My dollar is for donors and supporters. And then I have my comedy tragedy masks for artists, because I was talking about people working in theater. Okay, so now we're going to kind of put aside our audiences for a moment. And this is the time when, if you have anything at hand readily available that kind of lists some of your recent communications, you can use that. If not, you can just do your darndest to remember what it is. But I want you to go ahead and write down any communications that you have sent out in the past month or two, annual reports, end of year letters, postcards, social media, emails, all of it kind of counts. So go ahead and write down. If you can kind of be specific about what they were about, if you remember, great. If not, just make yourself a list, see what you can get written down. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do this too. Maybe 5 more seconds. And on this slide is an example of the one that I worked on. Again, not necessarily worrying about the neatest handwriting, but I just kind of wrote down some communications that I've sent out recently to some different folks. And then the final thing that I want you to do is take those communication examples and then take your audiences that you've created. And you can either use your specific audiences if you want to, or you can use those larger classifications. It's up to you. And I want you to kind of match them up. And whether you want to do that through creating a new list where you divide things into columns, whether you want to do it by drawing icons or letters next to them, or maybe drawing lines that kind of connect things back and forth, go ahead and see how you can kind of get things to match up on who you think should have gotten each piece of information, not necessarily who did get it. And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds for this one too. About 5 more minutes here. Five more seconds, not minutes, sorry. So part of why I like doing these webinars is that I get to kind of do the exercises and the practices. And so as I was working on this and doing examples, I actually learned a couple of things. So the one on the left is the one that I did first. And I did that one with lines where I kind of drew back and forth. And it's very messy. But one of the things that popped up is that when I was thinking through audiences that I might want to communicate with, I included kids because I work in a children's theater, right? So we serve a lot of kids. And then when I connected them to what pieces of, communication I thought should go to each audience, as you can see, I didn't actually draw a line between kids and anything in particular. So I started to think a little bit more about that. And I think it's because, kids aren't the people who decide where they're going to go necessarily, because they don't, they're not always able to transport themselves. And they're usually not the people who are deciding where to spend money. So while there are certainly times that we might opt to communicate with kids directly to get them excited or engaged in something, it's probably not where we're spending a lot of our communication at this point. And I don't know, maybe that's something that we want to change now that I've sort of done all this and I'm like, oh, we're not actually communicating directly with kids. Maybe that is something that we need to shift. And then on the right-hand side, I did a slightly different version, and I took some of my recent communications pieces and I went through and used those icons that I kind of established with myself, right? So there's an eyeball for spectators and a $ for donors and supporters, and my little comedy and tragedy masks for artists. And one of the things I realized when I did this is you can tell from a quick glance, a lot of what I've been doing recently has been geared towards spectators, not towards those other audiences. And so now I'm asking myself should I be communicating more with those audiences? Should I be talking more to our professional artists in the community who are doing work with us? Do I need to be doing a better job of communicating with supporters about what's going on? And it's a nice sort of check-in for me to see sort of a smattering of where I'm investing my energy right now and think about if I need to adjust it. And maybe I don't. I mean, maybe I don't need to communicate with kids, and maybe I should be investing most of my communications with my spectators. They are probably my largest group, so that might make sense, but maybe not. And so this was a really helpful check-in for me in terms of kind of where I'm investing my time and energy right now. So one of the things I want to talk about before we leave these different classifications of audiences is I want to talk a little bit about funnel. So where are people engaging with your organization for the first time? And then how do they move between your audiences? Now that you've established who these different audiences are, what patterns of movement can you pick up? So here again, we have our 3 different audiences, the graphic we've used before, and we have the couple that's in 2 categories and the group that's in all 3. But how might people move over time? Did this group of 3 that starts as that's in the musician category, is that where they started? Or did they start as a spectator and then move over there? Maybe they were a supporter first and then they decided they wanted to take up the clarinet. And so now they're performing in the community orchestra. That can be really valuable information to have, because if you start to look for those patterns, you can figure out what you're doing right, what you might be able to adjust, and how you can sort of capitalize on some of those natural flows. So what I would like you to think about is to adapt the idea of a sales funnel. So a sales funnel is a very corporate idea, and I know sometimes we get a little itchy around corporate money-making ideas here in the nonprofit realm, but it's a pretty useful idea. So the way the sales funnel works is that people move down, and as you move down the sales funnel, your group that's interacting with you gets smaller and smaller. So the first step is awareness, who knows about you or your product, and then interest, who's interested in you or your product, the decision to engage, and then the action to engage. Now, whether that action is buying a ticket, because then you have the money and you're happy. If you're corporate, that's probably all you really care about. For us in the nonprofit world, I think a lot of times the action is different. I think the action is actually participation. So I'm not, so I might throw buying a ticket more in the decision realm than in the action realm here. I have made the decision to attend lots of arts events and then never bought a ticket or go because I am busy and can't always fit it in, and then I'm sad about it. But I just never make it to that last point of that sales funnel. So we can sort of adapt and manipulate this into what I would call an audience funnel. So what I've done is I've sort of truncated and shifted. So at the top, we have our spectator, because I think my experience is most of our audience base, the most number of people, the place where people start most often is in that spectator realm. They come to a show, they buy a CD, whatever it might be, they're in that spectator realm. Then they move, then sometimes maybe they'll move into an artist realm if they're already an artist, or maybe your organization will even spur them into being an artist, and then into the supporter realm. So these three arrows that are kind of all in a line are a very common way for people to move through. But people can start in the artist realm. They can start in the supporter realm. And that's why we have the three arrows up at the top. And then people can also flow back and forth, right? So maybe a supporter becomes an artist. Maybe what your organization is doing is so inspiring that someone who has never thought of themselves as an artist tries a class, attends an event, and discovers they really like it, and they become an artist. Or maybe somebody starts as an artist and they really like your events, and so they're going to attend more and they're going to come back into that spectator realm. Maybe it's possible that they start as a supporter and, you know, they're writing you a check and giving you money because they really like the work that you're doing, but they're not quite to the spectator spot yet. So there are different ways that things can happen and people can flow through. And this can be helpful, again, because if you look at the patterns, you can identify what's exciting people and sort of capitalize on that, and then help people move in a way that benefits you and your organization. So questions to ask yourself as you're kind of applying the idea of this audience funnel to your organization. So how did members of your board first interact with you? And I just met, I was doing an series of introductions with the board, and as the board members were introducing themselves, I was sort of struck that without being asked, almost all of them shared that their first interaction with the organization had been as a spectator. They had come to an event, they really, really liked it, they came back to some more, and before they knew it, lo and behold, they were on the board, right? Another question you can ask yourself is, where are your participating artists coming from? Are they being referred to you from other artists? Are they people who have wandered in your door and signed up? Are they people that you've gone out and sought out because you feel like you're a good fit? So that's another potential question that can be helpful in this. And then what about your major donors? Did they come and see the work that you were doing before they gave? Did you approach them without them seeing your work and really sold the impact that you're having, so the actual art maybe isn't as important to them? If they haven't been coming to see your work, your major donors, how can you encourage them to do so? Do you want to encourage them to do so? So thinking about how you might be able to move people between these audiences can help you really strengthen your audience bases a great deal. We already did this slide. Okay, before I move on to the testimonial points, I was going to do a quick check-in. Are there any questions or anything else at this point?
Yeah, so we have two questions. One relates directly to the section you just talked about, so I'm going to start with that one. But what are your thoughts on using surveys to kind of gauge who your audience is or what they're looking for?
I think surveys can be great. But like any tool, you just have to be realistic in what information they're going to give you and who's going to complete them. You know, the thing about sending out any survey is you have to know what population you might miss that way. I was actually just at a presentation yesterday morning about engaging nonprofits to support the census in their attempts to reach the traditionally hard to reach population. So the census sort of knows like who's not going to respond, right? So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing a survey. But particularly in the day and age when people are mostly buying tickets to events online, it's so easy to set up SurveyMonkey or whatever you want to use to send people a quick response. I think one of the things where most of us are used to at this point is giving people our zip code when we show up at an event. That's a really easy way to kind of track where people are coming from. But also part of it is that a lot of this kind of audience classification work, you can do most of it extrapolating from people that you know. So you might know the spectator, you know your long time season subscribers, and you can have conversations with them about where they came from. So that general sort of anecdotal information can help you set up a lot of this if you don't have the capacity to write a good survey and market a good survey and then, process that data. So it's certainly a helpful thing to use, but I don't think it's necessarily a requirement for sort of thinking through and setting up some boundaries and ideas and guidelines for yourself.
Great, that was really helpful. And so this other question kind of goes back to your first section on branding.
Yeah.
What are your recommendations on how often you should update your branding?
This is so funny because it's one of those things that you hear different things from different people. So since the question was, what are my ideas about it? I'm going to speak for me. I think that there are obvious times in an organization's life when rebranding is good. So one is if you are hit a milestone, if you're 5, 10, 15 years, if you are shifting to a new location, that can be an excellent time to rebrand. And if you maybe have a change in leadership, that can be a good time to rebrand, because that transition in leadership is a time a lot of organizations sort of spend some time reflecting on who they are and what they're doing. I just had somebody tell me that you can't rebrand until it's been 5 years. I don't really know that I believe in that. I think there's like this window, right? So you do a rebrand and maybe within a year, you're like, okay, this is terrible. We should not have done this. Then don't make yourself stick with it for 5 years, go ahead and switch it. I think the real question for me is not necessarily a timeline, is it working? So if your brand is working, if people know who you are, if people can walk by that bulletin board and pull out your piece of, your flyer from everybody else's, then you probably don't want to do a rebrand unless you can connect it to something else that's going to give you some marketing steam, like an anniversary or a leadership change. If people are walking by the bulletin board and they can't find your stuff and recognize it, then you probably do need to do the rebrand because your brand isn't strong enough and you're not clear enough on it. And it doesn't mean you have to throw everything out the window and completely start over, but going back and looking at what you're doing and maybe, shifting your colors or your font or whatever it might be so that you have a clearer and stronger brand. One of the other things you always, of course, have to think about in branding is how you compare, and we didn't talk about this at all yet, but the other reason you might want to do a rebrand I can think of is if another organization pops up nearby that has very similar branding. And while we all think that we should be able to go to that new organization and say, hey, we were here first, you need to change, doesn't usually work. So that might be another time to think about doing some tweaking to your branding. So I really think it's more, not so much a question of how much time should go by, but how long is it serving you and being impactful?
Great, yeah, so it's kind of there's no hard and fast rules. It's really kind of on a case by case.
Yes, like so many things. But if your brand is working, keep it.
Yeah. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Mm-hmm. All right, great. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, so I did promise you an application, and the application that we're going to work through is the idea of testimonials. And it, I really appreciated actually the question about surveys, because surveys are a really great way to get testimonials. Is to, give people a box where they can write something about their experience, because that gives you great collateral to use throughout. So we're going to talk about some different types of testimonials and how you might use some for some of your audience classifications, but not others. So we're going to, for the purposes today, I kind of invented a fake nonprofit, which serves seniors with art. They provide art classes, this fictional nonprofit, both in long-term care facilities and at their own facilities. So they have seniors coming to them, they're going to seniors, they help them create pieces of art, and then they display those art pieces at a gallery that they have, but also in those long-term care facilities. So their primary population served, which is not necessarily their primary audience. So this is where this can get a little dicey because there's some crossover, but it's not a 100% thing. So their primary population served is those seniors who are doing those art classes, creating those art pieces. You can sort of follow, this is like a ripple thing, right? Like we all know that we have impact in our community beyond the primary population we're serving. So their secondary impact ripple is the families of these seniors who are seeing healthier, happier family members, right? And then the last ripple is the community as a whole. So if they're in long-term care, those community members might be people working in that long-term care facility. If they're at home, it might be that, you know, they're having kind of this ripple effect and the like first responders are maybe not having to interact as often with these people or somebody else. So it kind of just ripples out. And the sort of, and I did a graphic for this one too. So if you're more of a visual person, you can think about it this way, right? The center of our sort of bullseye are those seniors and those artists. That next ripple out is their families and caregivers. And that last ripple is the medical professional and community members. Also in that last ripple, to sort of start including this idea of audiences within the groups that we're serving is the public audience. So this fictional nonprofit has a gallery where the public comes and views the art just like any other art gallery. Okay. Don't get muddied down in the mire of this, but I'm going to talk us through it. So, and again, part of why this gets complex is because we have people who are kind of in both categories, right? So at the top, I have our audiences, our classifications of audiences. On our left column, we have our seniors, our artists. We want them to engage with our programming. In the middle, we have our spectator audiences. We want them to come to the galleries and see the work. And then on our last column, we have supporters. So donors, grantors, people, maybe the long-term care facilities themselves that are partnering with us so that we can be there. Those all fall into that category. So that top row, the row is which, the audiences we're communicating with. On the left in the rows, you have groups that you might pull testimonials from. So we're going to start at the top. We have our senior artist. So we have a gentleman and he comes to our classes in our space, and he has shared with us this great card. He wrote this great card and it talked about how he really appreciates what we do. It gives him something to look forward to every week, and he really enjoys the people that he's met. So that's kind of a testimonial. Hopefully it's a little more specific and linguistically pleasant than that, but that's the general idea of it. That testimonial is something that we can share to all three classifications of audience, because it's going to inspire seniors to attend our classes. Audiences are going to like to know that we're having that impact, and supporters are really going to appreciate knowing that we are having such a positive impact on somebody else's life. So then the next row is the family and caregiver. So maybe that gentleman has a daughter and she's also reached out to us and she says, I know my father shared this with you, but I just want to share as well. You've had such a great impact on his life. One of the things I really appreciate is that he's proud of the work that he's doing there. I haven't seen him that proud of something since he retired. And that's a really meaningful idea to share. Maybe not something that's going to motivate other seniors to participate in our classes, and maybe audiences don't necessarily care so much about it. But that is something that supporters, that those, when we're writing grants and writing our end of year appeal, that is a fabulous sentiment to share. And then we can kind of continue that through with other community members and audiences. And I have, we have the 3 X's kind of means it's a definite fit. And I sort of also have the single X's in those 2 boxes, because there are times where I can see, like if, for example, you have something like the Parkinson dance therapy, which I don't know if you've encountered, but it's the idea of using dance to help people with Parkinson's. So that's a little more medically specific. So it might be that something from a medical practitioner actually could inspire a senior to participate in these classes. And same thing with audiences, probably the artists themselves would appreciate hearing from the audiences that they appreciate their work. But it might not, it's not as much of a spur to action as hearing from their peers about what's going on. So again, the grid's a little complicated. I do understand that. But the thing to take away is that what gets communicated out varies depending on what you want from that class of audience. And there are things that you're going to use more particularly for one class than for another, and vice versa. Okay, any more questions? We just did 2. Are we good?
One question about the testimonials. So yeah. Say that somebody sends you a card, like you said, that a family member sends you a card saying, oh, you've done such great things for this family member. If you wanted to use that as a testimonial, what are the best practices for that? Do you follow up with them and kind of say like, hey, do you mind if we use this in our marketing? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I said that, I meant to mention that, so I'm glad it came up. Yes, you definitely, in particular, if you're going to use anybody's name, you really need to reach back out to the person. And I've had some people who have come back and said, no, that's just for you. But for the most part, people are really excited to help you with your message. So if in that instance, if I got a card, I'd make a phone call, or next time I saw the gentleman in, I'd say, hey, I got your card. Thank you. It meant so much. Is it okay if I use it in some of our communications with other people? And if they kind of hem and haw, one of the things you can say is, okay, would you be comfortable if I used it and I didn't use any identification information, right? So you can just say participant or artist. If you're going to use their name, make sure you obviously check with them. And then there are, of course, those of us who work with different populations. So there are some populations where it's really hard to get testimonials. For example, if you're working with victims of domestic violence, you can't really get testimonials from the people that you're serving directly. It gets really tricky. So, and as somebody who doesn't work in those sectors, I can't speak as much to that, but you definitely want to follow up and check in. The other thing that I will often do with testimonials is ask them if I can tweak it just a bit so that I can maybe correct, because sometimes people who are working with our programming don't actually use the correct program name that we're using in like a grant application, right? And so you can also say, can I just change, I'm going to use the name of the program when I use it, or that kind of thing, and check in. But you definitely do want to follow up. You don't want to just copy and paste and put it somewhere, because that can't make people kind of angry. So I wouldn't do that.
Yes. Okay, great. Thanks so much for answering that.
No problem. That was a good one. I like it when people are watching out for the stuff that I miss. Okay, so let's end with some practical suggestions, because I did promise you that, and we are running close on our hour here. So there are ways that you can organize this information to make it more readily available, and also make it easier to kind of share tasks out. So if you have a board member who wants to take a stab at writing your annual appeal, you have an intern who is working on your social media, you can organize some information and make it easier for them to kind of stick within this intentional system that you have set up. So the first rule, and I feel like maybe this is a no-brainer, is always identify your audience. So the example that I've used here is actually an event, but it translates really well. So we talk a lot about fundraisers, but there are lots of different fundraisers. And the main question with a fundraiser is, who do you want to be there, and how much money do you want to raise? And you have to be specific about who they are. And an important piece of communicating that is actually your ticket price. So that's another conversation that we can have at another time. But when you set your ticket price, you tell people who you want to be there. So if you're talking about, oh, we're having a fundraiser, I encourage you to think more specifically. Is it really a friend-raiser where you're trying to just get people excited and engaged in your organization, like they're at a different point on that sales funnel? Is it a boutique fundraiser, which is the term that I use for those small kind of fun one-off little events that maybe raise you a couple $100s? So if a local bar wants to do something for you, I think of those as boutique fundraisers. And of course, the gala is what I'm using as that really big, raising lots of money, fancy dress kind of thing. Or is it just an outreach event and you want populations that you're serving to learn about you? So think about really being specific in your fundraiser. Who do you want there, and what do you want the effect of what you're doing to be? And then to create yourself some shortcuts, right? So hopefully by the end of today, you'll have started to really classify your audiences. And you can finish that up. And then think about, and I encourage you to write down so you can share with others, what are some of the shortcuts? So we talked about reading level. What reading level do you want your information for your audiences to be, your spectators? And what reading level do you want information for your supporters to be? What technical terms might you use in one or the other? That call to action, what do you want them to do during their relationship with you is a really valid way to keep these classifications separate. Think about what channels you might be more likely to use. Social media is great for spectators because you can reach a lot of people at a lot of time, but there's also a lot of noise. And as much as we've tried to turn social media into a way to raise money, it's not always the best strategy. So think about that. And we talked earlier about pictures, right? So what's the subject of your picture, and how might what the subject is change which channel and classification it's going to be most useful on. And then once you've kind of created these shortcuts, one of the systems I use a lot, and I use a lot with my clients, is this idea of tagging information. I think in some file organization systems, you can actually tag an entire file. I tend to tag within the document itself. So for example, I have 4 or 5 pages of testimonials that I've gotten, right? People have written me letters, I've copied and pasted, and I save it all in a file. So when I need a blurb for a website or I'm working on a grant, I can go ahead and pull one out. And then what I go do is at the bottom of each paragraph, where I have an who said it, where it is attributed, and who, I have just some tags. So this is from an example about another fictional nonprofit that I made up that worked with cats. So the tag of this testimonial, it was a personal story. It was about vet bills. It tells the tone is joyful. And then I tagged where I thought I could use it. I could use it with a recipient, so someone that's being served, a donor, a supporter, a program, a grant, an appeal, and a website. And then when I need information for the website, I can open the document with all the tabs. I can do Control F or Open Apple F, depending on your system of preference. And I can type in website, and it will pull up everything that I've tagged as a good match for our website. And I've done a lot of that work ahead of time as I've collected things. And I can, keep an eye and make sure I have stuff for a good variety of audiences, and that I have thought about how it's going to be useful instead of just tucking it into a folder to never see the light of day again. So before I conclude, did we have another question come through?
Yes, we did. This is a good one. You've mentioned reading level a couple of times, and so someone is asking, is there an app or a site that you can go to check, whether your copy, what reading level your copy is at?
So I'm gonna say I'm sure there is, and I know there's reading. I know a lot of the apps that will tell you reading level of books. I don't have one off the top of my head. That's a really good question though. And I can research that. If anybody wants to shoot me an email, my email is going to pop up here in a minute, and I'll respond with that. The other thing I would suggest is to call your local library and talk to whoever works in your children's and youth services department, because they have they know all of those tools about identifying reading level. More, off the top of their head. But I'm happy to do some research into that, because that is a very good question, and I am 100% positive that there is something out there. I feel like there might even be something on Google Docs that I saw at one point.
Someone actually just, one of our listeners just piped up and said that reading level can be found in Microsoft Docs. I'm not sure where, but they're searching it now. So there's something to keep in mind too, but also thank you for offering the follow-up on that. And the library is a great resource too.
Yes, librarians love to help. It's one of their.
Yeah.
So,
great.
Okay, so just to conclude, you know, we're gonna come back to our fancy icons here. So when you're clear about who you want to reach, you're gonna just tell a more compelling story. And it's really one of the ways that you can capitalize and be more efficient when you're a smaller organization and, you know, you're trying to do as much as you can with probably a smaller budget and less expertise, is to just spend a couple of minutes thinking about which of my classifications of audience am I trying to reach today, and what might be the best channel or way to communicate with them. So so if you have kind of liked some of my tips and tricks in thinking today, I do have a number of tools that are available to nonprofits. And one of them is an organization quick reference. It's about a page and a half. It's a template, Microsoft template that you fill out, and it sort of organizes some of your really basic information. So some of it's legal information like your name and address. Some of it's brand information. There's a couple other things on it, and it just gives you an opportunity to have all that in one place and get it organized. And you can, and actually on the next slide, I have a better link for you to follow, and also my email address and my website are there. So if you follow that link, it's going to take you to the website and you can download that template to use. You do have to go through the checkout process, unfortunately, because that's a website thing. But I encourage you to take a look at that and start doing some organization around your information so that you are better prepared to reach out to those audiences. And I think that's all I have. So if there are any more remaining questions, I'm happy to stay on the line and take those. But I think that's it for today.
I think we are good. I don't see any more questions coming through. You covered a lot of really great information here, Ara. There were a lot of really great takeaways. I appreciated the interactive exercises. I know that always helps me. Sometimes when I sit through these, I don't really think about it, and then I go back later and try and do it, and you don't remember things as well. So it was really great to be able to kind of participate as we moved along, and I think people will have a lot of great things to take away from this webinar today. So thank you so much for taking the time to put this together and to talk with us. And thank you to all of you for listening in. I think that does it for today's presentation, but be sure to tune in next month in February. We're actually offering 2 great webinars. First up, teaching artist and cartoonist Jersey Drodes joins us on Thursday, February 20th to talk about how to document your classroom experience. So teaching artists, educators, you definitely want to tune in for that one. And on Thursday, February 27th, we welcome Jane D'Angelo and Gabrielle Stafura of Ohio Dance, who are going to talk all things event planning. So if you have a festival or some community event coming up, or you've been thrust into the role of event planner, that one's for you. So I think that's it for today. Ara, thank you again so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week, and we hope to see you next month.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks a lot. Bye.